Hi, in this video we'll be looking at how to work with files in Sharperlight. First we'll start off with creating queries that will query the file system and show a list of files in a folder, for example. Then we'll look at how to set up trusted and secure folders in Site Setup. Then we'll look at how to display files in the web channel. These would normally be images, for example, and they can be displayed from the file system or a blob in a database. Next we'll move on to how to upload files into the file system using the RESTful Service API, and also uploading files to a database using the writeback features. Let's have a look at some of the examples that we'll be covering in this video. Here's one where we have a web channel report that queries a folder in our file system. And this folder contains images, and what we'll do is display those images and also allow them to download the image. Next we'll move on to another example where not only can we view images in the file system, but we can also upload them and delete them from the file system. Then we have some examples where instead of pulling images out of the file system, we'll call a database and display a blob in the web channel. Then we'll look at how we can also create forms where we're doing data entry, and for example here we've got an example of a bug tracking system, and we've got a file button here so we can upload, for example, a scanned image of the error that's associated with that record. So this is writeback. We'll also look at how to use the RESTful Service API. So here's the index page for Sharperlight, and under the developers section of the menu we've got a RESTful Service help, and in there we can explore how to use the resources in Sharperlight so that we can get files from the trusted location or from the secure locations. Let's have a look at the first part of this video where we look at how to query the file system. You can see that I've restored the training example to a folder called train ff1, and under there we have a folder called resources, and under those folders we have things like scanned invoices and pictures of various items. What we're going to do is query this folder structure in Query Builder. To do that we go to Query Builder and select the system product, and then from the table lookup we go to File List. You'll find it under Scheduler because in most cases it's involved in scheduling jobs. Then we can enter the folder and output the items. When we preview it, you can see here we've got the folder structure, the name of the file, the file size, when it was modified, etc. Now we can filter these items. For example, if we wanted only files that had a particular type, we could filter on that using the file extension. In this way we can start to build up our report. But if I was to choose a folder that was not in a trusted location, I would get an error message. This is because first of all we need to go to Site Setup and define what are trusted and secure locations. The reason why this is important is because if users were able to query any file location, they may see things that they shouldn't. So what we do is go to Site Setup, Product Settings, System, and then there is two locations where we can define the folders. One is Allow Scheduler Files in Folder. These are what we call the trusted locations, and there can be more than one folder. So we can put a pipe character between multiple folders. And then we've got the secure folder locations. The secure folder locations will always require that the user sign on before they can have access to it. Whereas the trusted locations, if you're coming from the web channel, you wouldn't necessarily have to sign on to access those folders. So generally I use the secure folder locations for things in the web channel, unless of course they're resources for a web channel. Once the folder locations are defined, you'll need to restart your service, and then in Query Builder and the web channel we should see those error messages about not having access to those folders go away. Next, let's explore how we can pull the files out of the file system and display them in the web channel. So for example, I've got a folder called Kitchen, and under there I've got a picture of apples. What I'd like to do is show how we can display that file in the web channel. On the web channel's index page, you can see there's a menu here, and under developers we've got a link to the RESTful service help. This will explain how we can create URLs to retrieve those files. So let's click on help, and from the menu we'll select resources, and under there we have file get. There'll be various examples of how we can get files, for example from the custom folder where we have our branding, for example, and then we have data model content, and as I was explaining before, we have trusted locations, and we also have down here secure locations. In the examples here you can see that there's various ways of defining the file location. For example, we could just put in file and then trusted and then the file path. In my example I've put them under the secure locations, so I'd have to come down to these examples, and you can see here we've got file secured and then the file path to the file that we're looking for. Now for security reasons you may not want to show the users the actual path to the file. You may want to encrypt it. So one method is to use base64, where we can say secured hash and then the base64 location for that file, and then we've also got a means of encrypting it so that the user has no idea where the file is located or how to create the encrypted path to it. But let's look at the simplest example where we just put in the file location. So here's our file location here. It's in resources kitchen, and I've just prepared an example previously, and you can see I've got file, just like in the example, secured, and then I put the file path to that file called apples. And because it's in a secure location, I also had to provide a user session ID. If I didn't provide that, I'll just type in an invalid session ID up here. You can see that I've got an error. So this way we know that retrieving that file is a secure process. There's also the ability to put in relative file locations. So in site setup, when we defined that, we said that that was in the training folder under resources. And because there's only one entry in site setup, what we can do is say I'd like to get the kitchen folder relative to the folder that we've mounted in site setup. So this way we could change the site setup location at a later date and have all these links still work, all point to the new location. Having said that, now we'll move on to the first example where we've got a publish report that queries the file system and displays the file and then displays the image that's in that file system, and also provides a download link. So this was done in Publisher. So I'm going to open the example in Publisher now, and here it is. And let's have a look at the query that's behind this publish report. You can see it's calling the file system, and there's our folder location, and it's asking for all the files including the subfolders under that location, and we've pulled out all the fields, and if we preview that, yes indeed we are going to those folders and getting the files. Now to display these files as an image, we'll need to create a HTML image section using an expression. So let's have a look at how that was done. So here's our picture, and there's our HTML image tag, and this was created using one of the templates. So if I go into HTML, and under there's a section called File, you'll find that this expression is using this template here, which is View Protected Image File located in secure folders in Site Setup. So if we were to select that, I'll just select it again. You can see that it gives us an example, and it's got a hard-coded file path here, but what I've done is I've taken that file path and substituted it for the file path that is in my data set. So here it is here. So there it is. Now the reason why this expression is using encrypt private is that we want to keep this file path secure so that users can't modify it and go and fetch another file somewhere else. And that's why we're using this private key encryption. And down here we're passing our current user session ID because we're not using a trusted folder. If we were to use a trusted folder, it would look something like this. Okay, so down the bottom here we've just got the size of the image, how many pixels we want to allocate to the image area for that file, and we're assuming that all the files are going to be pictures of some sort. So that's how this section works, and the result is this, where we have 120 pixels by 120 pixels. The other example in this published report is the download. And again, there is a template to do this. So if we go to HTML files, you'll find that there's a downloaded trusted location and protected location. This one's downloading from the secure location, and it's using the private key to encrypt the path to the file, and then it's calling some JavaScript to open that up in a window. Let's have a look at the other example, which is a trusted location. You can see that instead of secured, we've got trusted, and hash meaning that, well, we want to somewhat obfuscate the file path, so we're going to use base 64, and instead of course hard coding a file path, we would substitute that in for whatever the file was in the current system. Right, so I'll just explain a little bit more about this template. Here we've got the save as. So by putting this as part of the URL parameters, we can say when we click on the file, what file name do we want to default the save as to. Let's go to the sample report here, and we'll go to the next page, and if we wanted to download that and click download, you can see at the bottom of my browser here, that was the default save as file name that we specified in that expression. So the premise for this example here is that the files are in the file system and not in a database, which will be covered later on. It is possible to create navigation menus to go through folders. I'll just show an example of that. So this is the Sharperlight web page, and you can see that we've queried the file system so that you can download various resources like training guides and the latest releases. So here we have some folders, and in addition to that, we've also created a tree structure on the side here so you can navigate through folders. And this was all done using the file list table in Sharperlight. And here's an example of a download, and also getting the link to the download, which will be one of these secure locations. Let's move on to the next example, where instead of pulling the images out of the file system, we pull images out of a database where there is a column that is of a data type blob. Here's our example in Publisher called database image, and if we look at the query behind it, you'll see that it's using the AdventureWorks database, which happens to have a table that contains blobs. So here are the fields. So there's one with a thumbnail and one with a large photo. So fields in databases have various data types. They can be dates, they can be strings, but what we're looking at here is a data type called image or blob, and they show up with these types of icons. Now, to retrieve these, you need to set the query builder mode to detailed. This is because these types of blobs cannot be aggregated in any way, so we need to get the data set as a non-aggregated data set. So I've selected the table, I have my blobs here, and if I was just to unhide these and preview them, you can see that the preview can show them, but when we push it out to the web channel, we need to turn that into something that HTML can understand. So for that reason, we actually hide the raw values. So I'm hiding those, and we then surface those images using an expression. So let's have a look at the thumbnail example. Again, there are templates, and what this is doing is calling the Sharperlight RESTful service and saying that we've got an image, and the image is encoded using base 64. This is just making the image, instead of a binary image, into some sort of character sequence, and then we're encoding that. So by default, when Sharperlight services these images, it'll encode them in base 64 for you, but there is a limit to how much a browser can handle as far as the length of these images. This is why I'm using the thumbnail using this technique. Let's have a look at the folder structure, and if we come under HTML, there should be a folder called images, and there we have some examples that this template was based on. So here's one example. So basically all I've done is change out image file goes here part, and I've referred to my thumbnail in the current row. Right, now for the larger images, which would exceed the limit of a browser's URL length, we can use this other technique, which is to register the image with the service, and then we call it by its registration number. So that's this bigger image here on the left hand side. Again, I've used one of the templates, and this template is images, and image display small or large. So let's have a look at this template. Just call that up, and you can see it's now saying let's display an image, but instead of getting the image as base 64, we're going to call up a registered ID. And this expression here is taking our file blob out of the database and giving it some sort of unique ID and registering it, and that ID is going onto the URL address, which can then call it up again. So if you're not sure how this works, just provide the blob here and provide some sort of unique ID here that will uniquely identify the image. So I've used the product ID, which I know will not be repeated anywhere. So the end result of that, if it's all done correctly, is when we preview, we can see the address location to the image. Now if I was to copy this and put it in the browser, I would actually see the image as well. And here's the more verbose form of that, where we're registering the image and then recalling it by its unique ID that we provide. The end result is we get those images appearing in our web channel. Now if we're pulling images from a database, it also goes across to Page Designer. So Page Designer can also display these in PDFs, for example. Whereas if they're coming a file system, it can't do that. So that's one of the benefits of putting your images into a database. Now we can move on to how to upload files, and the first example shows how we can upload files into the file system. Here's our published report, and it's called File Upload, and what it's doing is it's allowing you to view a file in the file system. So there's one button there, so we click on that and it's showing it in an overlay window. So that's basically a link to the file. And then we've got the ability to upload files, so we can select a file and upload that and then delete it. So let's go to this one here, which is 311. What we're going to do is upload a file and assign it the order number. So if we upload 311, we want it to have 311 in its file name. Let's have a look at the folder structure. So here we have resources, and under there we've got a folder called invoice. What I'm going to do is, for order number 311, I'm going to upload a file, and that file should appear in invoices because our logic is targeting this folder for the uploads. So let's click upload, or browse for the folder, or browse for the file, which is this yellow invoice here, and there's no errors. So if we go back over to here, there's a new entry in that folder, and if I click on view, there it is. And if I click on delete, say yes, I want to delete that, and now it's gone from the folder. So what we'll do now is look at publisher and how that logic was done. Here's the example, which is file upload, and if we have a look at that, we've got a manufactured dataset called custom dataset, just to create an example of customers and orders that are coming in. So this was using custom dataset. Now I could have used any table in SAP Business One or Dynamics, for example, but for training I've used this technique so that anyone who downloads the training examples can run them without having a full system. So there's our data. If I preview that, here's the logic for the view, upload and delete buttons, and as before it's HTML. So let's have a look at this expression, and you can see that we've got a section up the top where we define our HTML, and then we've got an expression that takes this template by whatever name it's called, and it replaces some tags inside that area. So it's looking for a tag called order number, and it replaces it with the order number that we have in our dataset. In this way we can create a long piece of HTML and pass in parameters to it. Okay, so this is standard HTML button and label input, and this input is getting a file, and when we do that we're calling a event. So on change event we're calling a function. Now these functions are not defined here in the expression because it would make it too large and it would repeat for every row. So we've centralized these functions in another area using publisher resources. I'll show you how that works later. There's no templates for this particular example because it would depend on the site that you're working on. Okay, so we've got some HTML, and on the click events we're calling functions. So the view button, if I click on that, it would call a view file function and it would pass in the order number. And for the upload we've got our import type file, and we're calling upload file, and we're passing in some of the event details. This is a more complicated example. For the input file we have a HTML input of type file. Now normally this would show a button with a label on the side, but I don't quite like the styling for that, and for that reason I've created a label, and using this for part here it basically takes the place of that input HTML section, so I get a bit of sense of styling. And again we call our upload file function, which I'll show you shortly. For delete we've got a delete button calling the delete function, passing in the order number. Okay, let's have a look at where these functions are defined. I'll close Query Builder And if I come over to options, you can see that you can define resources. And what I've done is centralized all my functions in JavaScript into a file in my file system, and then I've pulled it in using resources. So let's have a look at these files. Here I've got Visual Studio Code, and in the example folder I've got a folder called scripts, and under there we have our functions defined in a HTML file. So remember that we were calling a function called upload file, delete file, view file, for example. Well, this is where they've been defined. So here's our upload file, and it took two parameters. One was the event, and one was the document number, delete file, and view file. Let's have a look at the view file first, because this is probably the simpler of the scenarios. So we've got our function name and the parameter, and here we have a RESTful service call that we saw before, where we're calling the file, and for security reasons we just want to encrypt that path to whatever file's been passed in. So here we're doing base64, and we've got our default folder location, and we're using the document number as a seed for that file name, and we're putting the user session ID onto that URL. This window overlay is built into Sharperlight, so we're just calling that, saying open that URL up, and we've got a bit of title there, and then how big the window is. So when we run that, it'll look something like this. So we click that, and there's our window overlay, and there's that title that we just saw. The next one is file upload. So here we're using standard HTML and JavaScript to take the event, and then from the event we can get the target file. So this is a structure under the event, so target and then the first file in the list. So there's our file object, and in JavaScript there's an object called file reader, and here we're telling the file reader to get the data as a URL structure, and when it's finished loading, so this is our event loader, we're going to call the post method in Sharperlight, and we're going to call the update action. So basically we're going to take that file data and pass it to Sharperlight's RESTful service call. So let's have a look at what Sharperlight says in the developer section. So again, on the main index page you come to RESTful service help, and then from the menu you select resources, and in this case we want to post the data because we're uploading data. So this is the documentation on post, and so the URL will be file post, and then you do a post method, and what we need to do is pass it a JSON object that says the type of action. So it can be save, update, and then we have the location to the file, and if we specify absolute path, that works fine, but we can also use this ... syntax so that we can say it's relative to the secure location that we put into site setup. So I've used that method in this case. This example shows it ... and then we've got a folder and then a file name. You can specify a modified date if you like, that's optional, and then you've got the data. So this will be that data that file reader was doing in JavaScript. So if you do a post method and you provide this JSON data, it will save it to the file system, and you'll get back a response. And the response will say if there was an error of some kind, and if the error is blank, well then you know everything was fine. The response also tells you the URL of the file that was just saved. So here in this example you can see it's responded and saying, well, if you want to retrieve this file back, here is the file location link to that, and with some other details about how big the file was. Let's move back to the JavaScript now and have a look at that post method. So we've called file upload, we've used the file reader, we've loaded the data, and we've called the post data function, and we're saying we're updating it. It doesn't really matter if it's save or update, they basically do the same thing. And you can see here we're going to combine the save folder with the document number and then put JPEG on the end. Now for the folder location, I've used this relative path here instead of saying D drive resource test resources. By doing this, it means my code's more robust, and if someone changes the file location later on, this code will continue to work. If this folder doesn't exist, the RESTful service will actually create it for us. So we've called this post function, and here's our post. There's the JSON object that we require, that we saw in the RESTful service help. So we have an action, so save, update, basically the same thing. There's the path to the file that we want to save, and the data. Then we do an AJAX call, so this is using jQuery. We do the post. There's our endpoint, so we've got file post, and because it's secure we want a user ID, and we take that object there and stringify it for the RESTful service call, and that will go off and post the data. Once it's complete, we call post success, and we just check there to see if there's any error messages that have come back from that service. Okay, so now we'll look at the delete, which is a lot simpler. We've got to confirm here just to make sure that they really want to delete it, and then we just call that post data with the action of type delete. Now if we delete files, obviously we don't need to provide any data, we just need to provide the file location. So that's why we're not bothered about passing any data there. So now we'll move on to how to bring external files into Publisher, and we'll talk about resources. So these are in that example training folder, and the reason why we've edited these externally to the Publish report is because there are some very nice editors like this one here, and it's a lot easier to edit these and create and modify the JavaScript in these editors instead of doing it inside Publisher. So what Publisher is doing is synchronizing. Let's come back out and look at resources, and if I was to click edit and I had a file that I wanted to bring into Publisher, what I'd do is click on new, and of course I can just embed straight text here as a resource, but I can also bring in a file. So I then browse for the file. So let's go to our training folder, scripts, and there's the file there that we're editing over here. So if I open that up, I can then give that resource a code like this. I'll just give it any old code at the moment, and what will happen is if I edit that file and resave the publish report, it will synchronize with your file system and bring the file into the publish report. So I'll just manually do that at the moment. So it's brought it in, and there's the file size. If I add something more to this file, I've just typed a few more characters, and I'll save that, and then I'll synchronize again, and you'll see the file size will go up. It's now imported it into its published resource space. So that's how you can synchronize resources with your file system, and you can have any number of these resources. The next step is to use it. So to bring the resource into the publish report, I've used the header section of that report. So we come into here, and I'll just do this again. So I'll say import, and because I have resources defined, it will not go to the file system, it will go to the resources and ask me which resource do I want to drop into that header section. So I'll go, it's this one I've just created, and there it is. So that's how the resources are brought into the header or the footer of your published report. Now obviously I don't need that one, I've already got this section here. And let's have a look at the report again. In published reports there's a prompt section, and then there's the actual report content. So we don't want these functions to go into the prompt section, we actually want them to go into the report section. And for that reason there was some additional tags just to say where we want the header to go. Is it up here or is it down here? And to assist with that process, we'll see that up the top here is saying that this whole section here is to go into the report content. Otherwise, when you click the button in the report, you won't find the function because this will be in the wrong section, or be up in the prompt section. So there's our report content section begin, there's our end at the bottom. Now if you're curious as to where these tags were discovered, if we looked at the references section here, and publisher, it's got some templates to say, well, I've got some JavaScript and I want to put it in the report section. That's usually where you want to put it. So we would select that, and you can see here we've got our report section tags and then a bit of JavaScript. So it's basically followed this pattern. Okay, let's just confirm that our changes have worked. So what I'll do is I'll come over to this file here and I will uncomment out this alert. I'll save the report, and I need to click apply in Publisher for it to resync with the file system. Okay, so now we can run that report again, preview, and I'm going to do upload, select a different file this time, and you can see that that alert has indeed kicked in, and it's showing us the raw data that we're uploading. Let's move on to the next example where we upload files into a database table using writeback. The Foundry has a number of templates, and one of those templates has an example of writing back files to a database, and it's called the issue tracking sample. So I'm going to use this for this part of the video. So in Foundry I've selected templates and then issue tracking sample, and if we have a look at the tables that are defined, so we've got products, the tracking type, contacts, and then track. So here we've got the columns for that table defined, and some of the columns are attachments. So these are going to use file image or a blob in a database. So unless they're set up as a blob or an image of some kind, it's not going to work. So this is the example we're using here. And when this is compiled and you view it in the web channel, you can see here we've got tracking, and I've got already entered some records, and on the side here we've got an edit button, and that'll bring up the auto-generated data entry form. So we can put in all the fields that we require, the priority, etc. But what we're interested in here is these attachment entries, and there's a file button, so we can browse for a file, click on it, and that's basically it. We can also clear that out. So we have two attachments for this, and then we can submit it and come across here and view that attachment. So let's have a closer look at what's happening in the database for this to work. In Studio I've opened up the data model that was created by Foundry, and if I go to tables and have a look at the track table, you can see that we've got some attachments, and let's put it into some folders. Here's our field that contains the image. So what's important here is that in Studio it's set as binary, and then up the top here our data type can be binary, document, picture, etc. But it's set it as binary document, so it could have uploaded an Excel workbook, for example, or a PDF or an image. If we were just setting them to images only, we could set it to binary picture. And what we've got here is some assisting fields, so for example the file name, the file type, and file size. If we didn't have these fields, it would be ambiguous about what the blob was. How do we know if it's an Excel workbook or a PDF or a text file? We wouldn't know unless we had these additional fields here to distinguish it. So that's how all things are defined in the Studio. Let's look at the actual report and what it's doing here in the View button. So here's the Publish Report pack that Foundry created for us, and there's one here called Track, and if we edit that query, we can see the logic that it's built up for us. So here it's put an expression that creates an overlay to show the edit form, and if we come down further, there's our attachment, and our query mode is detailed, otherwise we wouldn't see that attachment because aggregations can't be applied to attachments, images or blobs. Then we have an expression that does the View button. So let's have a look at that, and similar to before, we've got a section up the top where we've got HTML, and it's basically opening up a URL which is that registered address, and here we're looking at the file type, and based on the file type we're trying to set or tell the browser how it should open it up. So the browser, if it's an image and we say the content type is a GIF or a JPEG for example, it will display it straight away. But if it's, for example, a Excel workbook, we're coming down to here, which is XLS, XLSX, and we're telling the browser how to open that up, which is in download mode. So it'll open it up and give it a default file name, which is whatever that attachment is. So this was all built up for you by the Foundry, but you can use this as a template. The reason why this template is quite useful is because the examples so far are all images. So we basically showed them in the browser, but you can see here, if we click View, we get a picture. But let's come to the second entry here. We'll edit that, and this time we'll update a different file type, which is a Excel workbook. So I'll upload that and save that. So if I click View here, I don't want to see an image, I actually want to download the Excel file. So I click View and there's our download. So that's what that expression was doing, just handling the different types of file types. Before we close this video with a summary, let's have a quick look at Scheduler and how the files are used there. So this is one of the training examples that was used in the video on Scheduler, and it has a query combinations that's querying the file system to get a list of files that are in a drop location. So let's have a look at that query, and you can see it's using the file list table, and it's reading the files in a folder called Scheduler writeback, and there's the results. So we're getting some CSV files and occasionally an Excel workbook, and this is used as a driver for all these actions. So we're looping around getting one row at a time and then executing these writebacks. Now Scheduler can query the file system. It can also do actions such as file copy, file exists, file delete, file wait, and compression, and moving folders as well. So that's something to be mindful of, that you can actually manage the file system as opposed to just reading it and calling the RESTful service to upload files and delete files. It's also possible using the query builder to use expressions to analyze files. So here we're querying the file system, but you could also use an expression, and if we just come down here, we've got a folder called files. So as long as these file paths are in the trusted location or the secure location, you can find out the size of the file, whether the file exists, and if it's a PDF, for example, you could get the PDF comments or zip file comments out of that file, and that way you can very easily query the file system just using expressions without going directly to the file list table. Okay, let's look at a summary of what we've covered so far. So the first point that we covered was that before we can query the file system, we have to define what are trusted locations and secure locations. Secure locations being that we always have to have a signed in user before we can access those resources. So that's this section here. And the trusted locations, well, that scheduler will use both of these, but the trusted locations in the web channel do not require a user to sign in. If you had images or JavaScript files that you didn't want to secure, you could put them up here. And if you've got multiple folder locations, just put a pipe between them. Next, we looked at the RESTful service help in the web channel, and it can be accessed through the index page under developers help. And in the resource section, we discussed how to use the get and post methods. So the get method was basically, we had two locations, a trusted folder format and a secure one. So we could get the contents of the file just by using the file path or a base 64 version of that, just to make it a little bit harder for users to know where the file's coming from, or one that's totally encrypted. We also discussed how we could use relative file references. So instead of defining the full path to the file, we could use the ... syntax, or we just use the folder direct. So in the example, I think I used kitchen. So instead of saying training resources kitchen, I could just start the reference from kitchen. And because there was only one folder in site setup defined in the secured section, it was able to work that out. And then we discussed about the options for pulling images or blobs out of databases. So we looked at the Foundry created sample, which was a tracking example. Next, we looked at how to pull blobs out of databases, and we discussed how setting the data type for the field, the column in the database, was important, and that we needed to query those columns using detailed mode, not summary report mode. So here we discuss the data type, which is binary, and that could be updated using the writeback in Sharperlight. That brings us to the end of this video, which is somewhat technical, but these are the steps generally required for writing back and accessing files in your file system.